The house had been abandoned for over 2 decades, yet the table was still set for dinner. The chandelier above flickered sporadically as if disturbed by a presence. When authorities finally forced their way into the old colonial mansion, what they found made even the seasoned officers freeze. At the head of the long oak table, perfectly seated in an upright posture, was a skeleton. Not buried, not hidden, just calmly waiting as though dinner had merely run late. The Wexley estate sat at the edge of town like a forgotten tombstone, draped in ivy and shadow. No one had entered it in 23 years, not since the last of the Wexley family disappeared without a word. Children used to dare each other to touch the rusted gate, and older folks crossed the street when they passed it. There were no buyers, no visitors, not even the reckless teenagers went there after dark. The house wasn't just haunted by stories, it radiated the kind of silence that felt too deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. That silence broke on a damp Tuesday afternoon when Eliza Marin, a low-tier property inspector, was assigned to assess the Wexley place for foreclosure. She had reviewed hundreds of properties in her career, but something about this one gnawed at her. The file was unusually thin. No maintenance logs, no repair history, no reports, just a name, an address, and a foreclosure stamp. There wasn't even a current key on record, which meant the county would have to force the lock. She almost refused the job. Almost. The locksmith arrived late, as if stalling, and refused to go past the threshold once the door was pried open. Eliza stepped inside alone. The air was stale but not musty, as if the house had been preserved in glass. Dust hung mid-air, unmoving. The grand foyer opened into a cavernous silence, thick and watchful. Her boots echoed against marble tiles as she crossed into the dining room, and stopped cold. The room looked lived in. The table was set for 5. Fine china, crystal goblets, silver cutlery. Each plate held the fossilized remains of what once resembled an extravagant meal: roasted meats, boiled potatoes, wine-stained linens. Cobwebs stretched between candlesticks, but the setting remained disturbingly intentional, like dinner had simply been paused. At the head of the table, in an upright chair, was what first appeared to be a mannequin, until she saw the exposed jawbone, the collapsed eye sockets, the yellowed vertebrae barely visible beneath rotted clothing. It was a skeleton, dressed in a dinner jacket, hands resting gently on the arms of the chair. Eliza didn't scream. She couldn't. Her body locked, breath caught in her throat, heart hammering in disbelief. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle. Whoever this had been, they had died in complete stillness. With trembling hands, she backed out of the room, whispering for her phone, already dialing emergency services. The responding officers arrived with masks over their faces, not for protection but for comfort. The house felt wrong, too intact, too frozen in its last moment. Forensics quickly confirmed the skeleton was at least 2 decades old, the same time the Wexleys disappeared. But there were more questions than answers. Why wasn't the body buried or hidden? Why sat at the table like a guest, or perhaps the host? An investigator found a calendar in the hallway still turned to October 2002, with one date circled in red: final dinner. Beside it, a dusty piano bore 5 wine glasses, all with lipstick prints of different shades. Upstairs, rooms were left mid-lived in, beds unmade, a bath still filled with rust-colored water. But there were no other bodies. No blood. Just one skeleton and a setting for 5. Eliza returned once more, escorted this time to gather a few more notes. While the officers documented the scene, she wandered toward the library, drawn by an odd rhythmic tapping sound. The windows were shut. No trees nearby. Yet the sound continued. It was coming from the fireplace. Inside, lodged in the soot, was a charred envelope. She retrieved it with tongs. The contents were half-burned, but part of a message remained legible. "They'll never leave until he confesses." She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But it deepened the discomfort, the sense that this was no accident or forgotten tragedy. It was a performance. A carefully composed scene designed to trap something, or someone. And the house, patient as ever, had waited for someone to look too closely. From that day, Eliza couldn't sleep soundly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the long dining table, the still plates, and the hollow eyes of the skeleton, watching, waiting. The Wexley house hadn't just kept a body. It had kept a secret sealed in ritual, and someone, maybe more than one, had intended it to be found exactly like this. Forensic teams swarmed the Wexley estate for days, trying to make sense of the untouched dinner scene. The first unsettling detail was the composition of the meal. Everything on the plates had long since decomposed, but there were clear indications that it had been a lavish affair. duck à l'orange, scalloped potatoes, a complicated tart of some kind, all consistent with an upper-class evening meal from the early 2000s. But who had cooked it? There were no signs of a chef or household staff ever being present, and the kitchen was spotless. No dishes in the sink, no utensils out of place. Everything had been cleaned meticulously, except the table. The skeleton, initially assumed to belong to Harold Wexley, the reclusive head of the family, was confirmed by dental records. He had been dead for approximately 23 years. But what confused investigators was the manner of death. There were no fractures, no trauma. The skeleton showed no signs of restraint or violence. Toxicology was impossible after all that time, but his posture suggested he had simply died mid-meal, seated with his hands resting neatly on the arms of the chair. As they examined the room, detectives noticed something even stranger. Each place setting had been arranged with surgical precision. Forks lined perfectly, napkins folded identically, wine glasses filled to a precise level, now dried into crimson stains on glass. But only one seat had been occupied. The others were pushed back, slightly askew, like the diners had stood up and walked away, or never showed up at all. What made the air grow colder was the discovery of the invitations. In a drawer in the sideboard, 5 envelopes were found, each addressed to a guest: Martin Caldwin, Beatrice Grange, Elias Renner, Margaret Wexley, and Harold Wexley himself. Each bore the same date, October 17, 2002, and a simple line inside: "Join us for a final dinner." No more lies. There were no return addresses, no indication of who sent them. All 5 people named had vanished around that time, their cases listed quietly as missing persons, linked only by loose gossip and vague suspicions. Detectives dug through decades of local records and uncovered that the Wexleys had once been the center of Ferndale's old money social circle. But in the late 1990s, rumors of fraud, embezzlement, and family disputes began to surface. Lawsuits had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. Investments collapsed overnight. And then, just as abruptly, the Wexleys vanished from public life. No one officially declared them dead, but the town assumed they had left in shame or secrecy. No one expected the patriarch to be sitting silently in his dining room for all those years. Among the dust and silence, a strange pattern began to emerge. Diaries were found upstairs, scattered through drawers and closets. Margaret Wexley's entries were the most coherent. In one of her last dated entries she wrote, "Harold says tonight is the night. He says we must all come clean. That the house will keep us honest. I don't know what that means, but the invitations went out. I think he's finally lost his mind." Another journal, perhaps Elias Renner's, simply had a scribbled page: "We were never meant to leave. He locked the doors himself." The theory among investigators grew more chilling by the hour. What if the dinner had been meant as some kind of confrontation, a confessional gathering orchestrated by Harold Wexley to force truths out of people who had betrayed him? Did he lure them into the house that night, lock them in, and demand they come clean? And what had happened afterward? There were no signs of a fight. No overturned chairs. Nothing broken. Just a room frozen in time. Fingerprints were found, but most had degraded beyond use. Still, partial matches indicated that others had been there that night. 4 distinct patterns around the table. One smudged heavily on the wine glass closest to Harold's seat. Another on the doorknob leading to the cellar, which, when opened, revealed nothing but empty wine racks and dust. The most disturbing clue was found behind a false panel in the hallway. Inside was a camcorder. Battery dead. Once charged, the tape inside revealed 15 minutes of shaky footage, shot from the perspective of someone walking into the dining room. The room looked exactly the same. The table was set. The candles were lit. Harold was already seated. A woman's voice could be heard saying, "This isn't what we agreed to." Another replied, "It has to be done. We owe him that much." Then silence. The footage ended abruptly, cutting to static. That video confirmed what many feared: Harold wasn't alone that night. Someone had recorded their final moments, or at least a part of them. But no one came forward to claim responsibility. The other 4 names on those invitations remained missing, their fates uncertain. Did they walk away from the house? Or were they still somewhere inside its decaying walls? The skeleton at the table wasn't just a dead man. He was a message, a monument to a night that had gone exactly as planned, or horribly wrong. Either way, it was clear: the Wexley dinner wasn't merely a family gathering. It had been an orchestrated event, and Harold had known, down to the last folded napkin, how it would all end. The investigation turned to the town's archives in desperation, hoping that somewhere in the pages of forgotten police reports, legal filings or buried newspaper clippings, the truth might be found. What emerged was a complex and venomous web of betrayal. Harold Wexley, it seemed, had been far more than a wealthy patriarch. He had been a man caught in the crossfire of secrets, lies, and revenge. 2 decades earlier, Harold had built his fortune on real estate, oil shares, and aggressive land acquisition. He was revered publicly but loathed privately by those who once trusted him. A growing list of lawsuits had targeted him, most of which vanished before going to trial. Among the plaintiffs had been his closest allies: Martin Caldwin, a longtime friend and business partner; Beatrice Grange, a former lover and investor; Elias Renner, a family attorney; and his own sister, Margaret Wexley. Their cases all pointed to one thing: embezzlement. Allegations of falsified contracts, diverted funds, and manipulation of trust surfaced quietly, only to vanish just as suddenly. Records were sealed. Complainants withdrew. And Harold, untouched by consequence, grew more secluded in the years leading up to his disappearance. Then came the dinner. With the strange, ceremonial nature of the scene now firmly established, investigators leaned into the idea that Harold had orchestrated it as his final act, not as a victim but as a judge. According to Margaret's final diary entries, he believed the only way to truly reckon with what had happened was to bring everyone back to the table. He didn't trust the courts. He didn't trust the town. He trusted the house. And the house, in turn, had become something more than a home to him. It became the stage for judgment. What no one could piece together was how only Harold's remains were present. There were no signs of a mass grave, no records of others leaving. But an answer finally emerged from the most unlikely place: an old confession misfiled in the basement of the sheriff's department. 21 years ago, an anonymous envelope was submitted to the local precinct. The letter inside was written in a shaky, trembling hand. Read: "We sat at that table and he told us everything. Said we ruined him. Said we would stay there until the truth came out. But none of us could look him in the eye. The doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. We screamed, we begged. One by one we left the room, somehow. I don't know how. I don't know if I ever really left." The letter was unsigned. The case it referred to was never linked to the Wexley house, until now. Investigators combed through the town's older mental health records and found something chilling. In 2004, a woman named Beatrice Grange had been admitted under a false name to a private psychiatric facility in upstate New York. She had been deeply paranoid, muttering about a dinner table, about someone who never forgave, and a house that wouldn't let go. She had died 3 years later from complications due to malnutrition, refusing to eat, claiming every bite was cursed like Harold's. This was the first concrete link to a second guest from the infamous dinner. If she survived, then others might have too. But where were they? The house offered one final clue. During a late-night inspection, one of the investigators noticed a shift in the floorboards beneath the dining room rug. Upon lifting it, they found a trapdoor with no lock, nearly invisible to the eye. It led to a small crawl space, narrow and suffocating, barely wide enough to fit a person. At the end was a wall. Not a door. A wall. Carved into it, crudely and desperately, were the words: "He made us choose." Fingerprints confirmed at least 2 different people had touched that wall. Their identities couldn't be verified, but the message was enough. Whatever happened that night wasn't just a silent dinner, it had become a moral crucible. Harold hadn't poisoned them or locked them in with physical chains. He had forced them to confront something worse, their own guilt. And somehow they had escaped, but not unscarred. The local authorities concluded their investigation without any arrests. There was no one left to prosecute and too much time had passed. But the town of Ferndale would never forget. The Wexley house was sealed once more, declared structurally unsafe, though no one truly believed it would ever be demolished. Some things weren't meant to be erased. What remained was a skeleton in a chair and a table set for ghosts. No one could explain how Harold died, whether by will or by some darker force within the walls he trusted too much. No one could say how the others vanished or why they were never found. But everyone agreed on one thing: justice had been served that night, not in a courtroom, but in the dim candlelight of a forgotten dining room. And if you pressed your ear to the front door on a quiet night, some said you could still hear the clinking of glasses and the whisper of voices too heavy with guilt to ever truly leave.